Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're really glad you're here. We're really glad that we can come together virtually, even for a little bit of social connection, even in the midst of physical distancing. So the topic of our workshop today is designing your online scholarly presence. And I am your host. I am the head of digital scholarship at Tisch Library. And with me is my colleague, Andrea Schuler, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea Schuler and I'm the Digital Collections Librarian at Tisch.
So as Angela said, our norms for our time together today are that, I will share some of my perspectives about designing your online scholarly presence, a slide deck that I'll go through, and then we'll trade off past the microphone, as it were, to Andrea, who will also share some of her perspectives. But we definitely invite you to raise questions throughout. I think that we have the space to address questions as we go and help it to feel a little bit more informal, a little bit more like a conversation. And the way you can ask questions is via the chat. So let's get started. So I think of your online scholarly presence as a constellation of identities, of like public personas that you create, as well as professional or scholarly outputs that you create. And that constellation of identities and outputs can include things like a personal or professional website, which you might build on a platform like WordPress. It could include publications, whether those are journal articles and books or presentations at professional conferences, white papers, briefings, whatever kind of publications make sense for your profession or discipline. Especially for those of us who are in academic disciplines, another type of identity is your like scholarly profile. And I guess I would think of that as like I guess your CV, your curriculum vitae, but it would exist in a number of different formats, and we will talk about what I mean by scholarly profiles in a bit more detail later on. An example of one of those scholarly profiles is an ORCID, which is a form of researcher, a unique identifier for a particular researcher and all of their publications and presentations. Another aspect of this constellation of your scholarly presence could include the data that underlies your publications. So not just the argument that you're advancing in your publications or presentations, but also the evidence that underpins that argument, which you can share for reuse and applications by other researchers. And finally, I would say that an aspect of the constellation of your scholarly presence may include your social media presence, depending on how you draw the boundaries between your professional online presence and your personal online presence. So the other framework that I want to offer you is that this process of curating or designing your online scholarly presence, it's an ongoing process. It's not a once and done activity. Particularly at transition moments in your career, you might give more or less attention to different aspects of this process. So I would say some of the continually occurring steps in this design process include, first of all, establishing your presence in some of those various formats that I discussed on the previous slide, sharing your work in an ongoing way as you create new work, networking and building your social network of colleagues, both in person at conferences or similar industry events, or virtually online. And finally, once you have established your presence and shared your work and you are continually networking, you're going to want to monitor your presence so that you have a clear idea not only of the persona that you intend to represent to your audience, but you also have a clear idea that that is in fact the persona that people encounter when they search for you online. And so I thought I would start us off with a little bit of an interactive exercise where I ask you to search for yourself online. And I by no means ask you to share with the group of all of us what you find, but I will show you what I find for myself. So the question, an important question to ask is, what will people find when they look for you? So if you're on the market, often people Google candidates. So the way that I'm going to ask us to do this exercise is to search your names using a specific search engine called Start Page. And I am going to, can someone confirm that what you are seeing on screen right now is my browser and not my PowerPoint presentation?
We're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Mm. And now are you seeing
If you,
browser?
we're still seeing the PowerPoint. So if you maybe want to do the stop share and then start the start page again.
Yeah, thank you. Start page now. Okay, thank you, Andrea, for your...
Sorry, it's working.
Okay, thank you all for your patience. Okay, so I am now going to search myself to see what my presence looks like. The reason, just FYI, the reason I chose Start Page is because it is, it's like a more private search engine, and so it's not taking into account your past web searches. So it's kind of like a blank slate web search that is closer to what a prospective employer might find if they Google you. And it's not complicated by it being your browser, because you Googling yourself might result in a different search results than a fresh search from a prospective employer. So when I search my name, I see my staff profile on the Tisch Library website. Not a bad first result. My second result is my personal website and Twitter. I notice here that my title is incorrect on the fourth result for LinkedIn, and it wasn't until I did this test search earlier today, preparing for this workshop, that I was like, oh yeah, I do need to update my job title in LinkedIn. So I feel like that's a good example of like the value of continually doing this check. And Yeah, I think overall, I would say I'm very pleased with these results. They're kind of traces of my previous employment. So at ZSR Library at Wake Forest University, at Boston College. I am a fairly active publisher within the field of librarianship. And I find it interesting that none of my more scholarly publications appear in these search results. Rather, it's the stuff that was sort of born online that is coming up higher in the search results. So those include a webinar that I was an invited panelist on recently, and as well as a blog post that I contributed to an online magazine. And those might not necessarily carry the most weight when it comes to my promotion, like, yeah, when I go up for promotion, but it's important for me to know they're the search results that people are going to find when they look for me. So now, Andrea, do you now see my PowerPoint again? Okay. So I'll return to the presenter view. So before I continue, I'm curious to know, this is a totally optional question, not obligatory, but I'm curious to know if if you did this exercise, if you searched for yourself just now, were you surprised by anything you found? And feel free to use chat or to unmute yourself and chime in.
Yeah, I think the group is small enough that we could probably unmute if you want. I don't think it's going to affect the bandwidth of the chat.
I was a little surprised because apparently there's an actress with my name, which I did not know. I think the scholarly things kind of align with what I expected to see in terms of like my LinkedIn profile, my Twitter, graduate student council stuff.
Yeah, the name thing I think is really interesting. One of the reasons I go by Chelsea Juliet Rowell professionally, number one, I'm very attached to my middle name. I share it with my mother and grandmother and great-grandmother and great-great-aunt. So that is one reason. But the other reason I do it is because it makes me so unique. Like, I have a pretty unique combination of first and last name, but there is another Chelsea Rowell who spells her name Chelsea. And so that is one of the reasons that I always use my middle name in publications and stuff like that. So disambiguation is definitely a part of managing your online presence, having people be able to distinguish you from other individuals with the same name. And we'll speak to some strategies for that. Any other surprises or interesting observations from searching for yourself?
My Tisch Library profile was also my very first results. And there are a lot of Andrea Schulers out in the world. So I feel like somehow that is targeted for me, I have to think.
Nice. Did you search in Start Page or did you search?
Yeah, Start Page.
Yeah, interesting.
Like I have an Olympic skier that shares my name and like she comes later than my Tisch Library librarian profile.
Interesting. Cool. Any other observations or insights?
I mean, when I search, the first thing that comes up is a place in Kashmir, which I share my first name with. So I have that, and then it's my LinkedIn. So that's okay. I feel like
pretty good. Cool. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, one of the first steps in designing your online presence is establishing an online presence and doing so with intention. So, questions you can ask yourself at this point in the process include, will you create a personal website or portfolio? To the right, you see a screenshot of my professional website. Will you publish a blog? Depending upon your field, it is a way of establishing your authority. So I would say in librarianship, there are quite a number of like influential bloggers, and it's a way of shaping the professional conversation, contributing to the professional conversation, and also cultivating a reputation for expertise, which can be helpful either for attracting, for example, invitations, you know, to be an invited panelist or a keynote speaker or something like that. And I think that these choices are discipline specific and field specific, but in my professional field, there are some advantages to professional blogging. Another question you might ask yourself while establishing your presence is, will you cultivate a professional identity on social media? Also in my profession, you know, I think that this question is field and discipline specific, but also in my field of librarianship, there is a pretty significant Twitter presence. In fact, there was like a day ago, yesterday, what even is time, I'm not sure, but very recently this week, Matt Iglesias said something kind of snarky and disrespectful about librarians on Twitter, and it just attracted a Twitter storm of indignant librarians on Twitter who are highly, highly active. So in my case, I definitely have a Twitter presence because it helps to plug me into that professional network. And I made the choice that Twitter is primarily my professional social network. Like, I am Chelsea, librarian and head of digital scholarship first, but I do permit myself to be authentic in that social media space and have emotions in public. And again, these are personal choices. And a final question to ask yourself when establishing your presence is, how will you link out to your scholarly work? So your publications and presentations and things like that. I want to acknowledge, in talking about this stage in the design process, I want to acknowledge that many of us are probably in a heightened state of anxiety about the state of the labor market after graduation, whether you are on an academic track or a professional track. And yeah, that's a reality. I think that some of the strategies that we talk about, or that Andrea and I will share in this workshop, they're not, you know, follow steps 1, 2, 3, and we guarantee you a job within 3 months of graduation. But they are at least things that are within your control, and they are things that you can be intentional about to raise your profile, to establish your presence within your field, raise your profile, and begin to intentionally build your reputation. So, I said earlier that I'd talk a little bit more specifically about various scholarly profiles. I'm not going to go into great detail. A number of them include ORCID. Those of you in the sciences may also be familiar with Scopus and Mendeley, which allow you to basically all of these scholarly profiles, they allow you to say, I am Andrea Schuler, Digital Collections Librarian at Tisch Library. I am not Andrea Schuler, the Olympic skier. And it brings together in one place an authoritative list of all your works. I think it can be particularly helpful when name changes have happened, either for any number of reasons, right? People who change their gender identity, people who marry and take on another name, people who are international scholars and they have, you know, one spelling of their name in one country and then it's transliterated into a different language, and so they have a different spelling of their name in publications in a different language. The purpose of these profiles are really to help people to disambiguate and for you to have like an exhaustive central list of your publications. Oh, right. So I already started to speak to some of these points. ORCID is often my first recommendation if you're trying to choose among a number of different scholarly profiles or scholarly identifiers. ORCID is widely adopted. It connects you, and ORCID connects you as a researcher with your research. So each individual has an ORCID, which is a unique string of numbers. Mine has a bunch of 2s and 0s and N's and 8407. And this unique identifier stays the same even if your name changes and even if your name is represented differently in different languages. And increasingly, it's built into publication workflows and faculty research reporting. So just as a quick example of that, I recently published a book review, and when the book review went to press, at that time, the journal asked me to provide my ORCID identifier, and I did. And then as soon as the journal published the book review, that publication was automatically added to my ORCID profile without me having to go in there and manually do it. So ORCIDs have a lot of uptake in the sort of wider publication system and can help you, just to bring all your research together in one place and have it unambiguously associated with you as a researcher. You can also add a bunch of other stuff manually to your ORCID, like your employment history, educational history, invited positions, professional affiliations with professional associations, funding that you've received. So a lot of people just kind of turn it into their CV. Okay, another step in the design process is sharing your work. So I would argue, I would posit that making your work openly available can help to establish your expertise and grow your reputation, which helps collaborators to find you, certainly, but it also helps you potentially in processes like tenure and promotion. So I recently wrote a letter of support for a colleague who was up for tenure. And one of the main things that I had to speak to in my letter of support was my colleague's national reputation for expertise. And, I provided very specific evidence of their national reputation. And part of that included the high degree of citation of some of his publications. And I would argue that part of what contributed to the high rate of citation was the open availability of his work. Again, there are different factors for different people. There are different reasons why you might choose to be more open or less open with your work at different points in your career. For me and in my field, making my work very openly available only works to my advantage. And I share my work. I should have mentioned earlier that an ORCID basically just brings together all the citations for your publications. It doesn't make your work openly accessible. And I make my work openly accessible in a couple of different ways. One is that I deposit manuscripts into my institutional repository, and that way people can access it not just in the paywalled journal. I also share presentations in my Zotero profile. So you may be familiar with Zotero as a citation manager, but it also allows you to upload your own publications and presentations and make them openly available to other people. So my practice is that for journal articles, book reviews, stuff like that, I deposit in the institutional repository. Slightly lower profile things like presentations or conference papers, I share via Zotero. So I spoke to how personal some of these decisions are and how they will depend very much on your individual needs and circumstances. So some questions to consider, some questions to ask yourself when choosing whether and also where to share your work include: who can access my work? Will I receive a permanent link or digital object identifier to embed in my CV? Does the platform comply with copyright law? Andrea will speak more to that. Will I get download statistics for my work? Are there limits on file types or file sizes? Will search engines find my work? Will my work be preserved for long-term access? And finally, will depositing my work comply with government or funder requirements? I spoke earlier to my choice to share versions of my written publications in an institutional repository, like the Tufts Digital Library. But there are also disciplinary repositories like Archive, bioRxiv, and Humanities Commons. There are repositories specific to data, like Dataverse, which we have an instance of here at Tufts. Other data repositories include Figshare and GitHub. I mentioned that I use Zotero for sharing publications, or rather presentations. You can do the same in Mendeley. And there are also social networks like academia.edu and ResearchGate, and presentation sites like SlideShare and slides.com. So networking is part of the process of designing your online scholarly presence. And you might ask yourself, will you cultivate a professional presence on social media, or do you really want to reserve social media for your personal life? I mentioned earlier that I use Twitter. I'm like a librarian first, but then I allow myself to be a librarian with opinions, right? So you can see that I recently retweeted an image of graffiti in Hong Kong that reads, "We can't return," in translation it reads, "We can't return to normal because the normal that we had was precisely the problem." I am active on LinkedIn. It is not central to my online presence, and I'm not on Facebook at all. Other social networking sites that you might consider include LinkedIn, academia.edu, and I'm not super familiar with Mendeley, but I understand that along with citation management and publication sharing, it has some sort of social networking kind of feature. The last step is monitoring your presence, which is kind of where we began by searching for our names in start page. So the questions you want to answer while you're monitoring your presence are who's viewing your work and also who is citing your work. So you could, for example, look for a particular publication of yours in Google Scholar and see the cited by feature. I am a fan of a particular service or platform that's called Impact Story. So Impact Story allows me to connect my ORCID, so all of the presentations and publications that are associated with my ORCID, and then it allows me to say, here's an open version of that citation. So whether that open version that isn't behind a paywall but is accessible to anyone, that could be in the institutional repository at Wake Forest, where I started my career. It could be in the institutional repository at Boston College, or more recently, it could be in the institutional repository of Tufts. Impact Story just allows me to bring all those publications that I deposited in disparate repositories and make them all findable in one place. And you know, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little gratified at the badges that I unlocked, that I am in that every single one of my papers is free to read online. And it also kind of speaking to this question of like who's viewing my work, it tells me that my research has been saved and shared in 7 countries, which is pretty cool. So a couple of these monitoring tools include Impact Story, your Google Scholar profile. You could certainly create a Google alert for your name. There's an altmetrics bookmarklet that you can add to your browser that would let you see various publication metrics for your particular work. And one of the things I'm least familiar with is a desktop app called Publish or Perish, which shows publication metrics a lot. Sometimes, you know, tenure track faculty use this when going up for promotion. With that, I'm going to conclude my time and pass the mic to Andrea. Before I do that though, I will just say all of these decisions are deeply, deeply personal. It's going to depend on whether you're in an academic discipline or a profession. And then there are nuances within specific fields and disciplines. So I laid out a range of options here. And if you would like thought partnership as you grapple with these options, you are more than welcome to reach out to me and Andrea directly to have a more personalized conversation. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to you, Andrea.
Thank you. Are you seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes, I am.
All right, thank you. Okay, so hi everybody. So I want to take the last kind of 10 minutes of our active time together before we fully open it up for questions to talk a little bit about your rights to share your work as part of your online scholarly presence, right? Chelsea talked about how that might be part of building your online presence. So I kind of want to think about like, what can you actually share? And in a lot of ways, this hinges on copyright, right? So copyright, the idea of copyright goes all the way back to the Constitution, which says that Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. So basically, if you have copyright to something, and you have copyright to a lot of things, that gives you the right to make copies and create derivatives, to distribute copies in public, and perform or display the work in public. So basically, if you are the copyright owner of something, you have the right to share it online, in paper, however you want to do it. And so anytime you're sharing work anywhere, you should kind of be thinking about, like, what are the implications of that? What rights do you have to that work? Who now has access to it? And what can they now do with it? Tufts has a policy that gets at this in some way, an intellectual property policy that governs all students, faculty, and staff here. For students, it says that students generally own the copyright to academic work they produce, including class papers, theses, dissertations, artistic and musical works, and other creative works. So that's important to know and really powerful, that the work you're doing here while you're a student at Tufts is work that you own and that you can share as you wish. That's very different from, like, once you graduate, if you go on into industry, usually your employer will own copyright to work you're producing while at work. Chelsea and I, as staff members at Tufts owns our copyright for work that we're producing here. If you're to go on in academia, typically faculty members do hold their own copyright to work they're producing, and that holds here at Tufts. So that's just something to keep in mind, both now here at Tufts and as you move through your career. So Chelsea talked about the various places you might consider sharing your work, but like, what actually can you share, right? If you have copyright to something, it's your right to share it wherever you want. And so for a lot of unpublished stuff, you probably definitely still hold your copyright. But if you have formally published something in a journal, in a book, potentially in conference proceedings, you probably signed some sort of author's agreement, and that may affect the copyright you have to your work and where you can share it. So I'm curious, can I see either in the chat or by the little hand function, like, has anybody signed a author's agreement? I see a hand there. Oops, sorry, I just jumped ahead. Oh wait, I'm not looking at the chat right now. Oh, sorry, my chat is not.
There's one more from Jessica and Chelsea.
Chelsea, I bet Chelsea read hers, I bet. Jessica, did you read it when you signed it?
Try to unmute her.
All right.
There, okay, there we go.
I skimmed it, but I didn't read it word for word because I didn't understand when I tried to read it.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that's on purpose. Like, I really believe that kind of publishers do that in some ways to be confusing. But I'm going to urge you, for folks who do sign one of these in the future, please read it, or always feel free to reach out to one of us and we'll kind of like walk you through it. I've looked at a lot of these over my time here at Tufts, helping other people through the process. So they range greatly in kind of what they look like. I've seen ones as short as 1 page, some as long as 7, 8, 9 pages long, with a lot of legal jargon in them. But there's kind of 3 things I'm going to say you should really look for if you're signing an agreement. 1, do you keep copyright to your work? Often the answer to that question is no. In a lot of the major journals, the journals do take your copyright so that they can publish them in their platforms. And that's okay, mostly depending on kind of what other rights that they give you to still use your work, just because it's typical right now. I would not say don't sign something just because they take your copyright, but kind of these next pieces are what you really want to look at. By signing an agreement, do they allow you to post a copy in something like the Tufts Digital Library on a preprint server or another scholarly sharing site like the ones that Chelsea talked about? Because that's really important. They've published it, but if you want to share your work in other ways, if you want to share your copies of your work openly, the publication agreement is going to let you know if you can do that or not. Again, most now typically are going to let you share some version. Most will not let you share like the nice final formatted version that's on the publisher's website, but most will let you share the accepted manuscript version, which is kind of like the last final Word doc you submitted to the publisher before everything went through. And then especially for grad students, can you reuse content published in the article, especially in your thesis? If you write an article that you then want to later use as a chapter in your thesis or dissertation, there are some authors agreements out there that do not let you do that or make you ask for permission to use your own work later. That's pretty uncommon, but just something to keep in mind, that you want to make sure it explicitly gives you permission to use your article later in your thesis. And so by reading that agreement, that's kind of going to give you a sense of what can you do with your work and where can you share it if you are interested in sharing it. And the benefit of them kind of allowing you to share like that accepted manuscript version in a place like the Tufts Digital Library or a scholarly sharing site is that you can share it openly, whereas the copy that's published in the journal on the journal's website is behind a paywall and you need to have access to it. You know, here at Tufts, we have access to so much, but folks outside of academia at a less well-resourced institution do not necessarily have access to everything that we do here. There's a website called Sherpa Romeo, which is a really great resource if you are trying to figure out what rights you have to something that you've already published, or if you're considering publishing in a journal and you don't want to get like very far in the process and find out that they take all your rights away. So basically, the website's been around forever. They're saying it's in its public testing period, but this is a new interface for it. You pop in the title of your journal there and it'll kind of walk you through, here's all the rights you have if you sign an agreement with this journal. So the link is down there, but you can always just Google Sherpa Romeo. And then I also wanted to think about, right, we kind of talked about like you have rights to some things, publishers take rights to some things, but you can also license your own work. Just like publishers set terms for work, you can set terms for your work. If you've signed an agreement with a publisher for something, you probably can't put a further license on it, but you have blog posts, if you have images you're sharing, white papers, things like that, you can think about licensing them. Creative Commons is a great choice here. It's pretty widely known. You might see it on open access journal articles a lot. Basically, it's a public copyright license that enables the free distribution of an otherwise copyrighted work. So you, an author or creator, give people the right to share, use, and build upon your work that you've created, but they don't have to ask for additional permission. It kind of spells out explicitly how they can go ahead and use it. And the idea behind this is that this is going to lead to more scholarship being created and also at the same time more creators' rights being respected. So you can kind of see there's 6 versions here. The top are sort of the most free, leading down to the ones at the bottom with the most restrictions. So the CC BY license at the top just basically says, hey, I created this thing, I have copyright to it, you are free to use it however you want in any way, you just have to give me credit for it. And then it kind of goes on and adds different conditions. Share alike means take my thing, use it however you want, give me credit, but you also have to share your thing under this open license to kind of keep scholarship going forward. No derivatives means you can take my thing and share it, you can't change it in any way. And non-commercial means take my thing, use it however you want, except you can't make money on it. And then you can kind of start combining those in all different ways. And all you have to do, if this is something you're interested in, is you can kind of see down in the bottom left corner, you can just CC BY SA, that tells you you've assigned a Creative Commons share alike license on it. You can link back to the Creative Commons website, or they have little icons for all of their different licenses. So if you have a blog post that you want to license this way openly to kind of share it with the world, just slap one of those symbols on there. And yeah, you're good to go. And so the last thing I want to talk about before we fully open it up for questions, another way of sharing your work is when you ultimately deposit a thesis or dissertation at the end of your time here. That is part of your program. All Tufts thesis and dissertation, master's theses and PhD dissertation writers have to deposit their thesis with ProQuest. It goes into the subscription database, ProQuest Theses and Dissertations, that mostly universities, maybe large public libraries subscribe to, that allows users to search through theses and dissertations of authors largely US, but also around the world, and view and download the full text. So institutions who subscribe to this database have access to the theses, including yours that will be deposited into it. And folks who do not have subscription-based access can pay to access individual theses if they want. So you have to deposit as a part of kind of your terms of graduation here at Tufts. So there's a couple things when you go through the deposit process that are kind of like related to sharing your work and get at how people are going to view and access it that I just kind of wanted to touch on now, and happy to talk to this again when you get to the point of like actually doing this. There's a lot of different screens that you're walking through in ProQuest. But the first one we're looking at here is just kind of a clip of their publishing options tab. And they ask you if you want to do traditional publishing, which basically means your thing is in the database. Anyone with access can read it. Anyone who doesn't have access will pay for it. I believe you get royalties if anybody does pay for your dissertation, though I have never spoken to anyone who has seen a royalty yet, so I don't know. The other option is open access publishing, which means that they will take your thesis or dissertation and make it available to everybody, regardless of subscription access to the database. For that privilege, they charge you $95. So my recommendation would be choose traditional publishing. Do not pay ProQuest to make your thesis open access, because at the library, we will make your thesis open access in addition to it being in ProQuest. We put copies of all theses and dissertations into the Tufts Digital Library. So anyone in the future, you know, searching on your name, on the title of your thesis, on the work you're doing, that result will come up like in, say, a Google search, and they'll be able to access it that way. So you will not have paid anything, and your work will still be openly available. They also ask you at the bottom of this page if you want search engines to discover your work through ProQuest, which I think just basically means, again, if someone searched on your name, the title of your work, whatever, would the ProQuest result come up in Google? There's probably not a lot of reasons to say no here, except that it is driving traffic to ProQuest, but otherwise I would probably say yes. It allows more discoverability of your work. And then the other thing that's sort of related that they're going to ask you about is if you want them to register copyright for you. And this is kind of a personal decision. I can't really say yes or no here, but I just will tell you, you automatically have copyright to your thesis. As soon as you write it, you have copyright to it. You do not have to register it to have copyright. And we talked about the Tufts IP policy, which says you retain copyright to that. So registering it just sort of adds another level of protection. If you're thinking of publishing it, it may be worthwhile if there's anything like patentable in it or that you really kind of want to establish. Here is this thing, I had this idea in 2020 and 2021, I'm putting this very official date stamp on it. It also gives you some protection if you ever have to sue for copyright, which hopefully is an unlikely scenario, but so ProQuest will offer to do this for you. No, you don't have to do it, but it's something you could think about. I think ProQuest charges $55, yeah, $55 to register it. You can register your own copyright for $35. So there's just kind of a $20 bonus to ProQuest there. So just something to be aware of. Know that you do not have to do this to have copyright, but it may be appropriate for you. And that's always something we could talk through also. Oh, and the last point about that, you can also embargo your thesis if you want, which will delay the release of it in both ProQuest and the Tufts Digital Library by 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years after you deposit it. And I think now there's a form online. You can also get in touch directly with your grad school to discuss the process. You can't automatically like check off that option in ProQuest. You do have to speak with your school. And again, I think some of the considerations here are similar to thinking about if you want to register for copyright. Are you interested in publishing it? Is there something in there you wouldn't want someone to kind of get ahead of you before you can patent it, before you can publish it? For this, I'd say talk to your advisor, talk to peers in your program. This does kind of tend to vary discipline by discipline. And that's all I've got. So I think Chelsea and I are happy to answer any questions if anything came up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
But I love your final slide, Andrea. You got this, y'all. So what questions do you have for us?
Andrea and Chelsea, can we make the slides available to the group in addition to the recording? Okay, if that's helpful for you all to have those links and resources too, we can be happy to share those. Got a thumbs up on that one. Anything else?
Is it okay to ask a question verbally rather than typing
Yes,
it?
please do.
So if you had to kind of pick one of the many different types of online presences, like profiles, you know, Orchid, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever it is, would you recommend any specific platform? Like, do you think there's one more universally like checked or trusted one, or one that comes up earlier when you like look for yourself, or does it really just depend on what you want? I know you said it's also a very personal decision, like what you want to do with the different ones. So
I guess I wouldn't say that there is a singular or a singular best platform for building your online presence, but within kind of categories, like within the category of scholarly profiles, I'm a really big fan of Orchid, and I'm also a big fan of creating a Google Scholar profile, because a lot of your stuff, a lot of your publications are going to appear in Google Scholar. And so if you create a Google Scholar profile, you can claim those publications as your own. And it just gives you like a singular place where you can log in and look at like cited by statistics and stuff like that. Those are my two faves, I guess I would say. I think one of the big advantages of Orchid, which they're different, right? They have different affordances. So Google Scholar is just one more data point for looking at citation statistics. It's similar to like Scopus or Web of Science or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think the different advantage of Orchid is just having that unambiguous identifier for you as an individual researcher, and have that unambiguous identifier of you linked to each of your publications. And I also think that it just has a lot of uptake among publishers. And so like for someone who is sort of a distinguished faculty member right now, it's like a huge undertaking to go back and like associate all of your publications with your Orchid. With someone who is embarking upon their career, I'm like, create your Orchid now. Whenever you publish something, provide the Orchid to the publisher and just like make it easy on yourself to associate those publications with you.
great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Other stuff like LinkedIn and Twitter, and like whether or not you have a website, I think it's like very dependent on your field and your discipline. For me, LinkedIn is not super useful. And in fact, I get like weird recruitment kind of messages, and I'm just like, y'all, this is not how I'm going to find my next library job. I think, however, for other industries, it can be super useful.
I think
So.
it also tends to come up high on search results. Like I noticed it was high on your screen when you showed it, and it was high on mine also. So like I agree. I don't find it like useful in terms of like interacting within it, but in terms of having your presence on there, that might be just another thing to consider.
Yeah.
Andrea and Chelsea, I had one more quick thing. I know that you had offered before if someone has questions about, Andrea, I think it was particular to, signing something prior. Can you give some examples of those and how students could reach out to you for resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of help that we can provide, I think around publishing specifically, we can help you talk through like, if you have a manuscript, you're not sure where you want to publish it, we can help you talk through like, here's some journals that might be appropriate. If you're interested specifically in open access publishing, we can talk through that. Tish also has a grad student open access fund that will cover the fees associated with open access publishing. So that's something we can help with. If you're to the point where you've already kind of committed, you've had your article accepted and they've sent you the contract and it looks confusing or weird, or there's a stipulation in it that you're not sure about, we would be happy to look over that agreement, with always the caveat that we're not lawyers, but have like looked at a lot of these and can kind of advise in that way. I think those are the big ones around publishing. Copyright, if you're unsure, I guess if you've published an article in the past and you're wondering what your rights are to it currently or where you can share it, that's something I'd be happy to talk through also. And you can send me an email, you can on our website, you can make appointments directly with us. That is always welcome also.
We're almost at time here. So Raul, Neelam, did you have any questions or anything that not to put you on the spot, but was there anything that we didn't answer that you wanted to ask now?
I think it was very sort of, I mean, you guys did a great job of explaining things. I mean, there's a lot of resources that I didn't know of that I know now of. And I was just wondering, like, I guess academia works better for me as well. Like LinkedIn, I guess, just shows up first, but I don't know, like my academia edu profile wasn't showing up, and I don't know how to make that more prominent. Although, yeah, so.
I can't speak to academia.edu from personal experience. I will say that I have some reservations about the sort of, like academia, even though it's a .edu web address, it's actually a for-profit company. And so it kind of irks me that they would like use my freely shared scholarship and sort of monetize it for their own profit. So I have personal reservations about academia.edu. That said, I recognize that it has uptake and that it does lead people to get like, for colleagues to reach out and be like, hey, I saw that you published this thing. Can you share it with me, or do you want to talk more? So I cannot speak to your question, Neelam, about like making it appear higher in the rankings. I wonder if it might have to do with like the number of publications and stuff that you have shared, or just like filling out your profile to completeness, sort of like similar in LinkedIn, and it'll tell you like, hey, you filled out 70% of your profile or something like that, and they tend to push higher in the search results more complete, fully realized accounts. So that might be a strategy that you could try in academia.edu.
Okay, thanks for that. And I had no idea that it was for profit.
Isn't it so misleading? Yeah.
ResearchGate is also, I don't know if any folks are using that as well.
Yeah. In fact, last week, I don't have a strong handle on time at this point, but one of my kind of big email lists that I follow within my discipline. It's called like Humanist, and it's all digital humanities folks. There was just like a very active debate over the pros and cons of academia.edu, and I was just like, and so I think it's very real. The motivations to use it are as real as my concerns about their for-profit motives. So it's a personal choice. I have to run to my next Zoom meeting. It was a pleasure, y'all.
Thank you
Thanks so much.
Yeah, Chelsea and Andrea, thank you so much. And we'll be sure to share the slides with you, and stay well, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you for arranging, Angela.
Yes, thank you, Angela.